Hey, good day. We're going to talk about org theory today. Most people don't really think about organizations very often, like why they're set up the way they're set up. But if we're going to understand the bureaucracy, we need to figure out how to think about organizations. And there's some main categories in which people have thought. And so the textbook talks a little bit about the ways that we think about organizations. And I want to just talk a little bit about those with you today. The largest body of scholarly work on org theory really revolves around the structural approach. This could be how we develop structures, why certain organizations are structured in a certain way. A lot of this comes from classical organizational theory or bureaucratic organizational theory. And we'll cover a lot of that stuff, but really this involves how we delegate authority in hierarchies and how we divide labor up. The second set of biggest categories of theories are really about systems theories. Systems theories are really interested in understanding how an organization takes inputs, processes those inputs, and produces outputs, and eventually outcomes. Then there were some people who started listening and reading and thinking through how these organizations work and these organizational theories, and they said, you know what, there's some really problematic issues with these two major approaches, the sort of structural approach and the systems theory approach. The first is that humans matter. And so there was a whole group of people who looked at how different individuals affect organizations in different ways. And we call those the humanists. Then there were a whole bunch of people who said, you know, when we think about the structural theories and delegated authority, it all assumes that everything is the same. But inside organizations, these organizations are not just affected by those people who are in control of the organization, those who have delegated that authority, but organizations are shaped and shifted, and they develop cultures based on the people they interact with and the pressures that they face in the world. We call those pluralists. The government by proxy folks said, you know, as we increasingly rely on other organizations as partners or as contractees or grantees, as we give them money to do the work of the government, they don't really behave in the same way that we would anticipate if they were part of our organization. So we have to consider how we contract that work to them or how we give them authority to act in our behalf. And because of that, the organization might function slightly differently. And then the last approach is the formal approach. And the formal theorists more or less say we need to think about organizations as networks of contracts, and that individuals work for satisfaction, yes, but also for more money. We hire people who are specialized in a way that will help our organization. And instead of thinking about the organization broadly, we think about the organization as chains of contracts between people, and what can we learn as we modify those contracts. So let's talk about the structural approach. The structural approach is basically that the government has the legitimate power to make decisions within constitutionally defined limits and expect that people will comply inside that organization. So we give these organizations power and authority to act on our behalf. So think about Congress passing some law at the federal level that gives maybe the Division of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms power to implement some law for us. We anticipate that alcohol, tobacco, and firearms will then use that power that they're given in the law and subdivide those responsibilities in such a way that the work can get done, but then we'll assume that they're going to do the work. In the structural approach, that assumption of widespread compliance is a big assumption. But structure is the basic building block of organizations. Who has power in which sort of division to do what sort of purpose? And the structure is part of the core of that organization. We delegate to specific portions of that organization authority to act in a certain way. So think about the Department of Motor Vehicles. We have people inside the Department of Motor Vehicles who have authority to check driver's licenses. We have a whole division that deals with that. We have a whole division that deals with licensing and registration of vehicles. Different set, and they don't really cross over. Also, maybe within the Department of the Interior, for example, we have the Office of Surface Mining. We have the Bureau of Land Management. We have other organizations that deal with different component parts of that organization, but they really deal with them separately in isolation. So hierarchy is the byproduct of this, that as we delegate authority and we create branches in our organization, that organization then becomes a hierarchy of people who've given us power and the people who we report to over the thing that we've been given authority. So in the structural approach, there's a distinction made between the position that a person holds and the person who occupies them. So in creating the structure, we say this position should have this power to do this sort of work. but we don't really say who should be there. We just say that there should be a person there who can perform this specific function. And so we assume that regardless whoever has that position, they'll do that job equally well as anybody else who was hired for that position. And there's like this little theoretical portion we should talk about briefly. There's this idea that principals have power over agents. And the principal who has power and resources, in this case elected officials, they pass a law, they give authority to an agency to act on their behalf. They empower that agency or that agent to do their work. The agent is highly specialized and expert. That agent then receives that financial compensation, that power, that authority to do the job. We hire agents who are highly expert, specialized, and we ask them to then report back to the principal over the thing that they've been given charge over. So the principal delegates power, authority, resources to the agent who has specialized expertise does that function and then reports back to the principal. Now here's the problem, that agents who are highly specialized and expert know more about the thing than the principal does. That's just part of the nature of a principal-agent relationship. That's why a principal hires an agent to do their job for them. Otherwise, the principal would do the job for themselves. So the principal enlists the help of the agent. The agent knows more about the product and the service that's being generated. And so they have incentives to hide their behavior if they make a mistake. And the principals know that. So as the agents report back, that costs time and money to report back. But the principal may also monitor the agent's behavior. We call that a transaction cost. In that relationship between the principal and the agent wants to hide his behavior maybe, and the principal wants to make sure that the agent is doing the job. So in that process, the principal spends a little bit of time and money and effort and resources to monitor the agent. And embodied in that is that there's some hiding behavior, there's some shirking behavior, and the agent may be doing a good job, may not be doing a good job. Inside the agent, in this case, might be the bureaucracy. Inside that agent or that agency, we have organizations that are established to do that work for us. And so in this principal-agent model, we have the principal giving power to the agent returning and reporting, the principal monitoring the agent's behavior, and the agent, trying to report back to the principal. Okay. Now in the structural approach, we have some implications about how we do the structural approach. As we start subdividing responsibilities inside our organization, we want to make sure that every little agency or every little break in the hierarchical chain has a narrow defined specialization. In other words, that we are not creating new positions that are overlapping, but we're creating divisions of responsibility and accountability and authority that will serve a unique specialized function. For example, inside the Department of Interior, there's the Office of Surface Mining. Almost nobody in the whole world cares about surface mining, except for surface miners, the Office of Surface Mining, maybe regulatory bodies throughout the world, some multinational corporations, but it really doesn't, the general public doesn't really care about the Office of Surface Mining. But the Office of Surface Mining is tasked with performing very highly specialized functions in monitoring surface mines. Does a member of Congress really know that much about mining? Probably not. So the principal enlists the help of the Department of Interior in this case, and then inside the Department of Interior, Office of Surface Mining, they really just do surface mining. They might know a little bit about water, they might know a lot about engineering, they might know a little bit of wildlife, but their highly specialized skill that they bring to the table is knowing everything about surface mining. Inside that agency, any agency really, we have an internalized specialized structure to perform the task. So inside each organization, we probably have like a human resources department. We might have an internal affairs department. We might have a legal compliance department. And then we might have other functions that maybe do the job better or differently. But that internal specialized structure divides the work of the agency in such a way that it's efficient, that it's rational, that the authority is delegated properly, and there's some chains of accountability. Now, these structures provide the rules of the game for the agency's units and position holders. In other words, when we start dividing up authority in this hierarchy, we give them specific roles and responsibilities. In fact, each job has a classification. Each position has a responsibility set that says, if you look at a government job, it says maybe you'll be required to work 40 plus hours a week. You'll have to lift a specific type of load. You might be required to work outside or inside. And they'll tell you all the specific tasks that you're responsible to do. It'll also tell you the knowledge you need to bring to that job. And if you don't bring that knowledge to the job, they can't hire you. So the position requires a certain set of knowledge, and then it has clearly specially defined roles and responsibility for that position. Like I talked about before, the position matters more than the person who occupies the position, according to the structural approach. Now, what that does is it creates a staff of experts. In other words, every agency has a staff, or it fills up with people who know really small details about really intricate things, because as we've broken up the responsibilities to do certain things, they become highly specialized. If you think about a police department, they have bomb specialists, they might have a SWAT team specialist, they might have a detective that does homicide, they might have a sex crimes expert. Like, there are really, really clearly defined roles and responsibilities to attack every sort of problem that they might face. Now, what that breeds is a whole bunch of people doing really, really narrow, specialized jobs, and you don't want too many of them, because if there are too many of these people with narrow, specialized jobs, it's inefficient. But if you don't have enough to cover, say, like a day when somebody's sick, then that position goes unfilled for a day or two or 5. So there's this kind of weird balance inside the structural approach where you have these positions, and we don't want to create too many positions, but we have to have enough to be redundant. Okay, now, one of the other things that's important about the structural approach is that the agency doesn't get to really define what they do. Members of Congress set up the agencies, or the legislative body in the state, or maybe the city council. They have power to pass the laws, and in the laws they give power to the agencies. They also tell the agencies how they're set up. So for the EPA, for example, we have a division of water and air and hazardous waste, because we have separate laws that deal with those separate issues. But we know that, say for example, pollution crosses from the air into the water and maybe is disposed somewhere else, or maybe there's a hazardous waste facility that leaks something into the water. So which one does it violate? Well, in that instance, it's not really clear. Well, it might be clear. We'll talk about it in a minute. But interestingly, the EPA itself can't reorganize itself. It needs the outside organization that gave them power to restructure them. Okay, Gulick talks about the structural model and the classical model, and Weber talks about it in the bureaucratic model. We'll talk very briefly about Gulick. Gulick says, in each organization we need to subdivide and have clearly bounded jurisdictions of authority and responsibility. In other words, it's really important to know how we've delegated that authority and what functions they can perform. And we shouldn't have overlapping jurisdictions necessarily, because then we have inefficiency. If we have 2 sets of organization that are covering the same job, then they've crossed over jurisdictions and we have some inefficiencies. Gulick also said we need to subdivide positions of authority immediately under the top of the position. And in other words, we need to have breaking out of these responsibilities pretty quickly. Gulick was really fixated on efficiency, trying to figure out how to use these resources properly and make that structure work for us. And we'll talk about the principles of organization in just a second, but he said organizations should have a specific function, and they should just do that function. Now, Weber, he talked about the legitimacy of a system of authority, and it's a different way to think about the structures, but he really focuses on authority. So Gulick talked about these bases of organizations. In other words, organizations should do one of 4 things. They should serve a purpose, they should do a process, they should serve a client, or a specific place. And we can't focus on more than one of those. That's what it means, mutually exclusive alternatives. In other words, we got to focus on one of those things. So for example, we have a purpose-based organization like the Treasury Department. We have a process-based organization like internal affairs inside a police department, a client-based organization like the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Veterans Affairs, and a place-based organization, in other words, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the Orange County Transit, or Orange County Water Sanitation District. Now, starting from the very top, that focus, that purpose, that base of organization should be very, very clear for all the rest of the organization. As we start dividing those roles and responsibilities, we want to not divide them so broadly that we lose control. And Gulick talks about span of control. In other words, we don't subdivide beyond what we can probably manage. So we don't subdivide into 60 people that we supervise, we subdivide into maybe 4. Or maybe 6 people that we supervise and not 15. Because as we subdivide those responsibilities, we need to make sure that we're accountable. He also talked about having a single head for these agencies, so we don't have 2 bosses. If you've ever worked for 2 different people in the same position, you can please one but not the other. And then Gulick also talked about having separate line and staff. In other words, that there would be a group who would do some administrative functions,